You're listening to the San Joaquin Sound Podcast, the podcast about music in Bakersfield and the surrounding valley. I'm your host, AJ Rodriguez. For this episode, I interviewed Kris Tiner. He's a world-class trumpet player. He's had longtime collaborations with Mike Baggetta and Tin Bag, and also with pianist Cathlene Pineda. He's played in upwards of 100 different groups, including the Empty Cage Quartet, Wooden People, Psychic Temple, Evil Live, Garden of Souls, and Vinny Golia's Jazz for Models. Kris Tiner is the director of the DownBeat award-winning jazz program at BC. He's played on more than 100 recordings and played concerts all throughout Bakersfield and toured all over the world. He's worked tirelessly for decades to build up the jazz scene in Bakersfield. I'm excited to talk about Wasco. I like talking about all these sister towns that are right near Bakersfield. My dad was from Delano, and you grew up in Wasco, which is 30 minutes outside Bakersfield. Mm-hmm. You grew up in a musical family, right?
My dad was a drum major in high school, and he played trumpet and trombone. He was the one that suggested me to play trumpet as my first instrument. And he was the one that sat down with me and showed me how to kind of push the valves down in the right sequence and to get the embouchure together. But yeah, my grandmother, my dad's mother, was a church musician, and I just remember her. My earliest memories are her singing hymns, and she played piano a little bit. And she had an upright piano at her house that we always used to kind of bang around on. And her sister was a little bit of a black sheep in the family. Nobody really knows a whole lot about her, but her sister was named Mary Snyder, and she was a country singer. And
cool.
She toured around with different honky-tonk bands. And
That's cool.
I've seen some amazing pictures of her, like kind of publicity type shots. And I haven't been able to uncover anything about her. Maybe you will. You know, you're a better researcher than I am.
Yeah, that sounds fun to look up. Yeah.
But yeah, and then their parents. So the last name was Snyder. This is my grandmother's family on my father's side. They were like bluegrass musicians, and they not professional, but they were like family gatherings, and they would all get together and play string instruments and sing hymns and like bluegrass kind of folk music. So I grew up with those kind of stories, and both of my parents really loved music, and they met each other at a Santana concert.
That's cool.
They were childhood acquaintances, but they met each other and started dating. And went to all these like kind of classic rock concerts in the early 70s. And my dad loved Jimi Hendrix. My dad was there when Hendrix played the convention center in Bakersfield.
Oh, that's so cool.
And so my dad was always jamming on the guitar after work and stuff like that.
That's cool. Did he play in a band?
There was a couple things like his. There were 4 brothers and sisters, so 2 brothers and 2 sisters in my dad's family. And my dad and his brother were both musicians. His brother was a bass player and record collector. I remember my Uncle Daryl, he was always bringing me the vinyl records. He would go like check out storage units and yard sales, and he would bring me like stacks of Miles Davis records and stuff when I was in high school. And they had, I think, a couple things that they played in together when they were in high school. And my aunt, both of my aunts on that side were church musicians, and my Aunt Evie, who lives in Florida, was a pianist, and
That's
so
cool.
I mean they were all just always involved in music. Everybody on that side of the family.
Yeah. And so, what music did your parents share with you when they were like, "Hey, listen to this"?
Well, in their record collection, which I eventually got a hold of, my mom was into blues like B.B. King. She had like Curtis Mayfield and a lot of stuff like that. She still is. I mean, she goes out to hear music. She lives here in Bakersfield nearby, and she's out almost every night of the week checking something out. She was always at the Crystal Palace, and she comes to everything I do. She's like my number one fan. My dad was into Jimi Hendrix. That was his guy on the guitar, and Blue Cheer, like all the sort of early 70s classic rock. Yeah, and he was aware of a lot of jazz because they had like a stage band at Wasco High School that all my aunts and uncles played in when they went through there, and a band director out there in the 70s whose name was Mr. Bangs. And I got to meet him. He was substitute teaching when I was in high school a little bit. So he found out who I was, and he remembered my parents. And so he would always give me recommendations on jazz artists to listen to and stuff like that. So, There wasn't much of a jazz concert scene in Wasco, but through the high school music program, there was an awareness of it. And, I know that people were like putting bands together and playing parties and just that kind of low-key stuff,
What about the Muppets? Were they an influence on you?
Oh man. I mean, I remember seeing like Dizzy Gillespie on the Muppet Show as a kid, long before I ever picked up a trumpet. Sesame Street, there was such hip like 70s fusion music in those Sesame Street episodes, and Mr. Rogers was my favorite, Of course every episode of Mr. Rogers is underscored with this piano trio, jazz trio music. The Mr. Rogers Show had a pianist named Johnny Costa who underscored every episode with just this brilliant improvisational piano music. And it was just like magical when you're a kid watching that, and then on the ins and outs, of that show, between scenes, they would cut to his piano trio. Charlie Brown, there was so much great just jazz music featured in these programs that we had as kids growing up in the 80s. I was born in 77, so like all that early 80s TV programming. And, I became interested in jazz much later, like 12 or 13 years old. But at some point I went back and saw some old Sesame Street episodes and Mr. Rogers episodes and realized like this is like the comfort food, equivalent for me of music, is just hearing like jazz piano trio. It reminds me of just these blissful childhood moments,
Yeah.
So maybe that has something to do with the love I have for this music, because it goes way back.
I read that you studied with Miriam Grisso. That was your first teacher, right?
She was the band director at Thomas Jefferson Junior High, and also at Palm Avenue Middle School, where I went to middle school. So I started in 4th grade with her as my teacher. Wow.
So what was she like as a teacher?
Very strict and very stern. The students, a lot of them were scared of her, but she was very much focused on the successful performance of the music, and instilled in us quite a work ethic that I think was that stuck with me. And she also encouraged me to explore and find jazz artists. I was in 7th grade when I started listening to like Louis Armstrong records and things like that. And so I went to her, and she gave me a lot of suggestions of what to listen to. And she gave me an opportunity to play a solo piece called Blues in the Night. All right. So like she would take her top students to the KCMEA Solo and Ensemble Festival. And usually we were performing classical pieces. My first time I did it, I played like a Mozart piece and she played piano behind me. In 8th grade though, I told her I would love to play something that's a little bit more kind of swinging, a little bit more jazz oriented. So she had this arrangement of Blues in the Night. And I found a local pianist named Bob Ellis, who was, capable of like playing that piano part and improvising a little bit. And that was like the first time I got to play anything that felt like jazz. I wasn't really improvising much, maybe just putting a couple of embellishing notes here and there.
Yeah.
But I took that to the Solo and Ensemble Festival in 8th grade, and all the other kids were playing classical pieces, and I played this sort of bluesy, swinging version of Blues in the Night, which I had really learned off of a Louis Armstrong record, where he sings it with Oscar Peterson's band on a record called Louis Armstrong and Oscar Peterson, which I had checked out from the Wasco Public Library. And that was like my first real saturation experience of like a jazz album, that was really the first jazz album to really, it changed my life. That record changed my life. But this performance changed my life. I got a scholarship, and they sent me a check to be put towards private lessons. And I used that money to pay for my first private trumpet lessons with a guy named Rob Martins. He had just come into town as the high school band director at Wasco High. And he was a trumpet player, had a master's degree in trumpet performance. So with him, I got to start working on like the trumpet, proper, the trumpet methods, like the Clark book. And we started working on some classical trumpet stuff. So I started to shape up my technique, because of that.
I guess I never thought about that, but when you're in high school and you're in the band, your teacher isn't always the master of your specific instrument.
Right.
So that's something cool to have that. Yeah.
Yeah, Miss Grissa was a flute player. You know, the band directors have to take pedagogy classes so they can play every instrument, at least at the level that they're teaching it. But yeah, for me to have those private lessons where I'm sitting down with someone with a degree in trumpet, you know, gave me a chance to take it a lot further.
Tell me about the time when you were a sophomore in high school and you went to the North High Jazz Festival.
That was another life-changing experience. I had been playing with the jazz band at Wasco High School, now starting freshman year. And that was like, for me, that was the first experience I had playing in a band, playing jazz. I had that solo experience playing the Blues in the Night earlier, but that was like my dreams were coming true, you know, being able to play this music and improvise and experiment and kind of figure out how to, you know, play a solo over chord changes and stuff like that. And man, I got to get this straight. Give me a second to remember this.
No rush, yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Martins took the band my sophomore year to the North High Jazz Festival, and we played in their outdoor amphitheater. And I have a memory of we were getting ready to play a song, and I don't remember what song it was, but a huge gust of wind came just as I was about to play my solo, and it blew the music off of my stand and way up in the air and over the back row of seats in the amphitheater. So I'm watching my music just disappear, you know, from sight. Whoa. As I'm about to play my solo. And so I truly had to improvise at that moment and let go of like the scales and the chords that were on the sheet and just let go from what I knew. And I remember that being like, okay, here we go, you know, like kind of experience. And I remember like things working out great. I played like a great solo, and it was like a really inspiring moment. But at some point after that performance, I got a phone call from Dr. Doug Davis, who was the jazz director at CSUB, CSU Bakersfield. He wanted to offer me an opportunity to come to Cal State and play with the combos and maybe eventually the big band there. For me, that was like getting called up to the big leagues, you know, because Doug had been one of the clinicians at this festival and he had heard our performance. And, you know, he was recruiting me to come join the program at CSUB. But by my junior year, I was driving out to Cal State from Wasco and began playing with people like Jim Scully and Dennis Ham, Kyle Burnham, James Dethlefson, and some other folks who were in the program at that time. Caleb Moore was a bass player who plays with Mento Brew now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I got plugged in with the college guys through that experience. And it was Doug who basically, like, he made that happen for me. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think you were a trumpet prodigy. I don't think there's many sophomores in high school getting called by professors and saying, we need you to play with the band. That's really cool.
It felt special. Yeah. And, you know, it took me outside of that small town Wasco experience really for the first time. You know, I was aware of the program out there, and even, you know, in those days, like really the jazz scene in Bakersfield was centered around CSUB and what Doug was doing with the Bakersfield Jazz Festival. People like Paul Perez and Paul Kearley and Ken Bisano and all those great musicians that attended CSUB when Doug first came, late 70s, early 80s. They were still around and playing on the coffee house concerts, you know, at CSUB that would happen twice a quarter.
Yeah.
So I got to meet all those guys too. Doug asked me, I guess this was my senior year, to play on one of those coffee house concerts when he brought in a guest artist named Carl Allen, who's a world famous drummer and clinician who came through to do a clinic and a special concert. And that was a big moment too, because, you know, the band was like Doug on piano, I think. Paul Perez was playing saxophone. So, and I was playing trumpet. So we were playing Carl Allen's music with Carl Allen. But I think I was more intimidated by standing next to Paul Perez and having to follow his, you know, his solos for the first time. And I've been playing with Paul for, man, the last 30 years ever since. But you can imagine what that feels like as an 18-year-old kid and like having to step up after Paul Perez. I think of those like stories that Miles Davis would tell, like sitting with Charlie Parker for the first time and just like wanting to quit, wanting to destroy his instrument every night because he just could not keep up.
Yeah. I mean, we've only talked about, when you're still a kid, and you've already gone through all these pressure cooker moments that you've been able to succeed in. It's really cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that stuff is important because you have to come up with something that you didn't know that you had before, and I try to put my students in those situations as much as possible because I remember how big they were to me. And I remember getting that cassette tape of the performance with Carl Allen and listening back and not being totally satisfied with my performance, but hearing a couple of things that I did that I didn't believe I was capable of doing. And those little inspirations are important because they push you a little bit harder. And then you see where you're not measuring up. You can listen back and hear where I could have done this, at that moment, and I should have done this there, but this was good. And that sort of research and development, is important. And having those opportunities to play and hear yourself in a group with master musicians is critical, because if you're only playing with people that, are less skilled than you are, you never hear that.
We had a whole episode with Doug Davis, episode 14, about the Jazz Festival and Doug Davis's life in music. Do you remember the very first jazz festival that you performed at here at the Bakersfield Jazz Festival? So you've had success in junior high and high school, and how was the transition to CSUB for you?
Well, I mean, it was a decision that I had to make. But I mean, Doug was offering me a scholarship, and my parents really didn't have the capability of sending me away to college, and I wasn't totally certain that I wanted to be a performer. I was just interested in music, and I loved music, and I wanted to learn more about it, and I loved Doug, and I loved the experiences that he was giving me. So I stayed local. It made a lot of sense. It was basically like a go to school for free situation because of the scholarship, and I already had connections, and I was already playing around town. There were spots, coffee houses mostly. There was a place down on 19th Street called Java Jazz, which we were playing a couple nights a week. There was another coffee house up by BC on Mount Vernon called the Supreme Bean, and we played music there. And I was playing for weddings and private events, and so it was a lot to throw away. I was also looking at San Diego State where I got accepted, but I was a little intimidated by just like moving away and dropping all of this because I had a lot going on. And the Jazz Festival was here, and I had performed at the Jazz Festival twice as part of the Kern County Honor Jazz Band, which began my junior year. Some of the local band directors, Rob Martins from Wasco High School and Mike Bone from West High School and Tony Aguilar, who still works with this group, they started that in 1995, my junior year in high school. So I got to play with high school students from around Kern County who love this music, and I got to play in a real big band for the first time. And Doug would put that group as the lead-off set on Saturday afternoon at the Jazz Festival every year. So I got to do that junior and senior year. So it was a smooth transition into CSUB, and it was an easy decision for sure.
That's cool. So when you went to CSUB, you were known as the award-winning freshman trumpeter.
Oh, that was from the Bakersfield Californians. They got a hold of this story and did an article on me my freshman year, and that was exciting. It was like a big fish in a small pond type situation, and I'd already been working with a lot of the guys that I was playing with at that point. So by that time, my freshman year, I was writing a lot of music. That was the difference. I got really into composing through Doug's encouragement. So he gave us a spot at the Bakersfield Jazz Festival in spring of 1997. And that was the first time I saw my name on a poster like that, Kris Tiner Band. And yeah, that was on the Friday night of the Jazz Festival 97. We opened up for Kevin Mahogany, who's an amazing jazz singer, and then the Yellow Jackets after that. There were three groups on that bill. And we played a couple of my compositions in that set. And that, the Jazz Festival, you're playing for 3,000 or 4,000 people in the CSUB amphitheater, and playing your own music on that stage was a really exciting feeling.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I still have that poster in my space at home where I practice, my little office space, and it's when I sit down to practice trumpet, that Jazz Festival 1997 poster is right behind me.
That's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 1997 seems like it was a big year for you. One of the things that also happened was you and your group went to the Pacific Coast Collegiate Jazz Festival, right?
Mm-hmm. That was an event that it was big, and it happened every spring. It doesn't exist anymore, but Doug would take the CSUB big band, and usually if there was a combo or two from Cal State, we would go and perform for feedback, and it was a little bit of a competition. So they would have awards for like outstanding musician, outstanding combo, outstanding composer, and I eventually got a couple of those awards. But that was another step forward, is being able to play this music not in Bakersfield, up at UC Berkeley. And one thing that I always looked forward to with that trip was being able to hit record stores and and jazz clubs. Yoshi's Jazz Club in Oakland was like a real big spot. It still is, but for the kind of music that I was interested in at that time. And the Jazz Festival always brought in top artists. Like I remember seeing Chick Corea there at the Jazz Festival. John Faddis one year. Jimmy Heath. I wish I had a better memory for this stuff, but we would go to, Scully and Kyle Burnham and Dennis Ham and we would go to Yoshi's, and I remember checking out Wallace Roney's group, and I just became completely obsessed with Wallace Roney's music at that time. He was sort of the protege of Miles Davis, taking that music that Miles was doing in the 1960s forward, and that was like my favorite. It's always been my favorite period of music. So being able to go up to Berkeley and really just be let loose, to explore the city and go over to San Francisco if we wanted to, that was exciting.
Yeah. And it's cool because in that year, the group won the highest rated big band at the whole festival. Seems like really hard to win against a lot of, main music schools are competing.
Yeah, that was a big year. The CSUB big band beat out a lot of the CSUs, the other CSUs. I don't remember which ones were there, but yeah, and our combos got a lot of attention. One year, one of our clinicians was Steve Smith, the drummer, and the original drummer in Journey.
Wow.
And he was really impressed by what we were doing. I remember we played a Miles Davis piece called Gingerbread Boy off of that Miles Smiles record. Steve Smith wanted to jam with us, so he sat down and played that with my band, and I got to play with him. And usually that doesn't happen. The clinician just gives you some feedback and some pointers and what you could do better next time kind of stuff. But he was like, forget that. I want to play with you guys. And sat down and just jammed with us on this Miles tune.
That's cool.
Yeah, so it was a lot of fun, man. Those were crazy times. I was just in Berkeley driving around, just killing some time on Wednesday of this week, and I drove by the old hotel that we used to stay at, which has now been converted into housing for unhoused residents up there, the Golden Bear Hotel. And I took a picture and texted it to Doug and Jim and James and Kyle, and just, man, there's a lot of crazy memories at that place.
So you also had some records that came out. You got the Mento Brew, you played on one of the tracks, and you got Twirl, right?
Yeah, Mento Brew, that came out in 96, I think, or 97. No Dancing Please. That was my first opportunity I ever had to go in a recording studio, and Matt Munoz took me down to L.A. Where they were recording, and I played a solo on a song called Streets of Gold, flugelhorn solo. That was my first recording experience. And then the CSUB recordings that came out, I think there were two of them while I was a student there, Twirl, and then there was a follow-up called Tight. Doug put out those CDs really to highlight original music that was being written in the program and played on the coffee house concerts. And we recorded all that music at Cal State, and then Doug had it professionally mixed and produced. And man, that was like the first time I got to see my name on a CD,
Yeah.
Which is a big deal because, we're talking before streaming, before any social media or any of that, but like seeing your name on a physical album with the music that you recorded and put your heart and soul into, writing and rehearsing and performing and then recording. So that's something that we do up at Bakersfield College still. We with the students who are writing music up there. I remember that feeling, and I want them to feel that same thing of like, you put all this effort and passion into creating new music, and so taking it all the way to the finish line of like, creating a CD and or at least a Bandcamp album or something like that, and hearing it professionally mixed.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's cool. So you studied under Doug Davis. What was his teaching style?
Oh man, Doug was an enigma and still is, because when you're hanging out with Doug, he's just like so much fun. He's just waves of positivity, and I've never seen him say a negative thing about anyone. If he was, you wouldn't know it, because it's always with a smile. I mean, he's just a beautiful, amazing human being, and he was a guru to all of us in that way. We all just wanted to be just like Doug, because he was, at the same time, he's so deep and has so much depth of experience and knowledge, and we knew any question that we had about any form of music whatsoever, we could go to Doug and he would come up with an answer for us. It just really felt like we had someone in our midst, who was endlessly supportive and endlessly knowledgeable, and had been to places that we just, couldn't even imagine. Doug spent time in Europe after he graduated from Harvard, and just has so many great stories of like working with Leonard Bernstein at Harvard, and the connections that he's had throughout his life with jazz artists like Chick Corea, Eddie Moore, Benny Wallace, when he was growing up. So Doug was this sort of portal of information and creativity for us. And he also pushed us hard. His lectures were no joke. I still have boxes and boxes of notes. I mean, one single quarter, in Doug's 20th century music class, you would sit down, and on day one, he would give you just a book of handwritten notes on every composer. And you'd have to study that. And then, the information he's giving in his lectures would end up, being another book, a full notebook of notes that we were taking. He just wouldn't stop. The knowledge just flowed out of him. His final exams were legendary. His music theory courses, like the upper division music theory courses like form and analysis, were known to have final exams that would last upwards of 4, 5, 6 hours.
Wow.
Doug would order pizza for the class at about the 4-hour mark, when we're all starting to kind of, our energy is declining. And there were students that if they were still taking the final exam past hour 6 or 7, they would go home, they would follow Doug to his house and finish the exam at his house. And I was determined always not to be in that group. I wanted to finish while like we were all still at school. I remember one time I was living downtown off of 19th Street, and I thought, like, I'm gonna get my adrenaline pumping for this final exam in form and analysis, and I'm gonna ride my bike to Cal State and just like get pumped, for this. So I rode my bike to Cal State. I took the exam, and this was another one of those 7-8 hour exams for some people in the class. I think I finished it in 4.5 hours. And what we were doing was like analyzing Bartók string quartets. I expended so many brain cells on this part of the final exam. I remember like unlocking my bike, getting on my bike, and riding towards Stockdale Highway for the bike trail. And then my next memory is like waking up in the beating sun, like lying in the dust somewhere behind Trader Joe's off the bike trail. Like I had fallen off my bike and just was like, I'd passed out. Just from the energy of this final exam, and I ended up having to like walk my bike home most of the way. So it really took it out of you. So he pushed us hard, but he was also, just a endless encouragement, and still is to this day. And we all love Doug Davis with all our heart.
Yeah. I mean, he seems like he's very supportive, more than what an average educator is. I remember once you told me that you still had his home phone number memorized. Mm-hmm. And I think most educators would never want to give out their home phone number,
Yeah, Doug was different. Yeah, I house sat for him when he was on trips and stuff like that, and got to kind of dig through his collection of books and records. Those are always fun times.
And all of that group is like a family. Why do you think so many of that group went on to be educators themselves?
It's no surprise. I mean, we had so much fun hanging with Doug every day. And like I said, when I started CSUB, I wasn't totally sure that I wanted to be a performer. I was never into like the side of music performance where you're like putting on a show and dancing and wearing costumes and that kind of, and that's what it was, man. By the time I graduated college, if you were a horn player, you know, the music that you could perform is like salsa music maybe, or like big band revival, like Brian Setzer type stuff where you're wearing zoot suits and stuff. And so I never really latched onto that. But seeing who Doug was and the fact that he was able to have this career where he created music on his own terms, you know, he's an incredible composer and a pianist and improviser. And like when he sat down to play, you saw absolute 100% focus. Like we wanted that for our own music. He was a complete inspiration as an educator to all of us. And so maybe a couple of years into the CSUB experience is when I started to think like, man, I would love this, you know, coming to work, having an office, hanging out with my students, creating music, being inspired by my students, inspiring them, and then being able to play music on my own terms when and where I want to. Yeah, and I think I'm not the only one who picked that up, you know. Jim Scully's been running the program at CSUB for past 20 years or more, and he took over for Doug. Kyle Burnham teaches at BC with me, Paul Kearley, Paul Perez, you know, all of us on the faculty at BC. Tony Rinaldi, we're all former students of Doug Davis.
After you graduated from CSUB, you moved out of Bakersfield. You got into probably one of the hardest schools to get into, CalArts. What was that like moving out of Kern County?
Well, I had a connection at CalArts. So the guy I went to CalArts to study with was a trumpet player and composer named Wadada Leo Smith, and he's legendary. He's one of the most important musicians in the world, and his career started in the mid-'60s as part of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians in Chicago. And I was aware of him. I began to be aware of his music while I was still going to school here at CSUB. And Doug had taken us, I think my junior year, to a conference in Anaheim of the International Association of Jazz Education, IAJE. And I remember being in a hotel conference room that was completely packed for this music industry panel with like Herbie Hancock and a bunch of executives and producers and stuff. And I'm up against the wall, hundreds of people packed in here. And I hear this trumpet just blasting from next door. And I looked at my program and I realized that was a CalArts faculty concert. And Wadada Leo Smith was playing trumpet in a duet with John Bergamo, the percussionist, just the two of them. But I was stuck in this conference room listening to Herbie Hancock speak, and I heard the trumpet again, and I gotta get out of here, man. I gotta go hear who that is. I was aware of Wadada Leo Smith, and I knew about the program at CalArts, but I had to go hear this. So I got up and climbed as quietly as I could over these rows of people, and I remember making eye contact with Herbie Hancock, and he kind of gave me a dirty look, you know, as I was like the only person leaving this conference room. Ran next door to hear just the conclusion of Wadada playing this improvised trumpet solo with just a percussionist. That changed my life, man. I went up to him afterwards and said, you know, do you give lessons? I live up in Bakersfield. You know, I'd love to come work with you, and I'm really interested in CalArts. And he gave me his number. And so I started going to his house for lessons on, you know, one Sunday a month. And I would pay him for like an hour, but I would end up usually being invited to stay for dinner, and we'd watch basketball games and listen to his records and play together and explore his compositions. And that went on for a couple of years before I finally entered his program at CalArts. So I had that connection with Wadada, and that really gave me a direction and a sense of purpose, because I had checked out some of the other graduate programs in jazz studies like North Texas and Northridge and San Diego State, and I just didn't really feel like any of them were the right move for me. CalArts definitely was. And so what I was able to do there, hooking up with other students of Wadada's who were equally interested in improvisation and composition and putting all of this together in a creative way, that really set the course for the rest of my life.
You were still playing a lot of music. I know you were with the Kris Tiner trio at the time. How were you able to still perform while going to school?
The trio was a Bakersfield project, and we recorded a CD of my music and put that out as like a CDR release right at the end of my CSUB days. That was a fun project with James Dethlefson on bass and Brian Paula on drums, because that was the first time I'd had a band that was like a stable group of people exclusively dedicated to playing my music and my arrangements for a period of time. And so I learned a lot about how to run rehearsals, and how to like book gigs and like get everybody there and promote the gigs. When we did a CD release for our album at Barnes & Noble, back when they used to have live music, man, we had probably 100 people there, and we sold out of our discs. I think we printed maybe a little bit over 100 copies of that, and man, we sold 80 or 90 of them just at that one concert, and that's unheard of.
Yeah, that's
we
really
made
good.
So much money on those CDRs, and so I carried that experience into CalArts. And when I got to CalArts, I assumed everybody would have that kind of experience, but a lot of the students who had been there as students had, they were really high level. They were very talented, but they hadn't had a lot of experience playing off campus, and so I put a band together, and right away we started hitting up gigs in LA and playing off campus. And I feel like everyone else was impressed by that, but for me, it's just what I had been doing. It's like, you can't just limit yourself to what's happening at school. You got to get into the scene and go hit up jam sessions and find the musicians who are a little bit beyond where you are and find opportunities off campus, because otherwise you graduate and then what do you have? You've got nothing, without the guidance of your teachers and your faculty. So I had a lot of real world experience being a big fish in a small pond, being from Bakersfield and kind of doing what we were doing. We were like one of the only jazz groups in town that was doing this kind of stuff. And so that gave me a confidence that was helpful when I got to LA and started trying to, make it work as a small fish in a big pond. All right. Yeah.
I read about a group that you started around this time, Evil Live. That sounds intriguing. An 8-piece group playing the electric Miles Davis stuff with turntables. Can you tell me about that?
So that Miles Davis, based on that Bitches Brew era of Miles Davis, he had 2 drummers and percussionists, electric guitar, 2 keyboardists. And so we had all that, but instead of the percussionist, we had a turntablist, a guy named Kevin Farrell, who also played in my group. And so Kevin would use the turntable as like a percussion instrument. He wasn't just creating beats and stuff. He was like actually interacting. And so it was me and another horn player, and then the turntable. A lot of times we were creating all of this sort of polyphonic sound. And I mean, Kevin could do anything with that turntable. So, and he could also make it sound like sort of a hip hop element if we went into more of a groove direction. But, Miles has this album from that period called Live Evil, so we switched that around and called the band Evil Live. And we started hitting up rock and roll clubs all around LA. And when you're a new band and you're trying to book shows at these clubs, the first slot they will give you is Sunday night at 11 p.m. That's, the slowest day of the week, the last set of the night. And so that was our set for probably a year. We played every Sunday night at 11 p.m. at a different club all around LA. I mean, the Temple Bar, all these like well-known rock clubs. And until we had like run them all out, and they wouldn't book us again because the music was so weird, and we brought enough people to, at least make it work and have a fun audience. But it was not what anybody had in mind for like, the club atmosphere at that time. So we had a pretty good run, man. It was a lot of fun, just sort of freaking out at people all over Los Angeles with this Electric Miles music. It was so loud, the band was so loud, and I wasn't using any electronics or anything on my trumpet at the time. I was just blasting, and I had to come up with sort of new strategies for playing at that level of volume. And it really pushed me physically, to another level in my instrument, because I'm playing these solos, and behind me is 2 drummers, an electric guitarist who's just shredding, 2 electric keyboards, electric bass, and this turntable. And so everything was amplified, but me. That was challenging too. It was really hard not to just like go up there and copy Miles, because everybody's familiar with that. I wanted to try to do my own take on it as well.
Yeah.
That was a fun period. Yeah, we made a recording which we put on a website once, but we couldn't do anything with it because it wasn't our music.
What about the Empty Cage Quartet? That's another avant-garde group you did.
Yeah, we were all students of Wadada at CalArts, so this was my second year there, and we wanted to start a band. It was mainly the brainchild of me and a friend named Jason Mears, who was a saxophonist. Paul Kikuchi was the drummer, and then Ivan Johnson was the bass player. So our initials of our last names were MTKJ. Mears, Tiner, Kikuchi, Johnson is actually how we started, and that on the concert posters it looked too much like a law firm, right? Mears, Tiner, Kikuchi, and Johnson. So we shortened it to MTKJ, and then eventually we started going on tour. We did a couple West Coast tours. We made a bunch of records. I was with that quartet for 15 years. I remember one point we were up in Northern California or Oregon coast somewhere playing, and we were hanging out with some folks who had come to the show and who was putting us up after the gig. They had a house by the lake, and these guys were smoking pot a little bit and like kind of getting loose. And like one of the guys was like, "Oh man, I got it! I finally realized this is Empty Cage. Whoa, man!" And he thought it was like this deep thing that we were trying to think. Like he figured out the words "empty cage" were coming from the initials MTKJ, and we were all like, "Yeah." Well, let's use that. So we changed the name on the next tour. Changed the name of the band from the initials MTKJ to Empty Cage Quartet. And that was right in line with when we got signed to Clean Feed Records, which is a jazz record label based in Portugal. And we did 2 albums with them as the Empty Cage Quartet, and then a couple albums after. But yeah, we went to France and on a grant and collaborated with some musicians in Montpellier in South France, and did a record over there with Aurélien Baynard and Patrice Soletti, a clarinet and guitar duo. And that music is some of the recordings that I'm most proud of in my career. And then the 2 records on Clean Feed. We had a good time with that band, And one of the things that made that group work is, Paul, the drummer, lived in Seattle. Ivan was in LA, I was in Bakersfield, and Jason, the saxophonist, was in New York for a long time. He was in Japan for a little while and then moved to New York. So we had home base in the Northwest, in Southern California and in New York. So we did multiple tours up the West Coast and then in the Northeast. And then we did a couple of things in the Midwest and Chicago. So we were able to get ourselves out of our local zones and to be able to collaborate, because we had this band that was located in different parts of the country. It worked out for all of us, yeah.
I want to take you to the Schindler House in West Hollywood in 2004, and you're doing an Exquisite Corpse concert.
Man, you're digging up all this stuff that I haven't thought about in so long. That was, there was an organization in LA called Sound, and they were very supportive for many years, putting together sound artists, from the jazz and improvised music side of the spectrum to new music and composition side of the spectrum, and microtonal artists like Craig Grady, who was another composer down there that I worked with for years. They were a lot of really great people, and I did several events with them that was based on this model, the Exquisite Corpse, which was a game that the surrealist painters would do, where they would fold up a piece of paper and each artist would draw, a segment of the paper, and then they would pass it to the next artist who would draw their segment without looking at the previous artist's work, and then they would pass it on. And then at the end, you open it up and you see the connections. So it's this sort of collage of different ideas that are unified into one picture. So the musical equivalent of that is, of course, a concert where each musician contributes their own piece or their own part of the experience, but then it moves on to another musician or another group. And the Schindler House, I believe that one we each did solos, and there were a lot of musicians involved. One was Petra Hayden, Charlie Hayden's daughter, who played violin after I played. Gosh, I wish I remembered everyone else. Do you have the information there of who performed on that?
I don't have it written down. I do have a I found it from a newspaper article, and I just thought it sounded really cool.
Yeah.
So I wanted to hear more about it, but I don't have it written right here.
We did another one of those in Chinatown a few years later on Chungking Road, and it was called Chungking Corpse. And these were, we had duos, improvising musician duos situated all the way down the street. So it started with two trombonists, Phil Teal and Bruce Fowler, who played with Frank Zappa. They were the first duo. And then all the audiences down there in between, on the street, in between these two trombonists that are on each side of the street. This is all on YouTube. You can find this recording. And then the audience moves down the street, and then the next duo is me on one side of the street with Alicia Mangan, who's this improvising tenor player. And we're playing back and forth at each other while the audience kind of moves through. And then the audience continues on, and then the next duo is I think it was Dan Klukas and Eric Sabar, I think, who's a brass player from L.A. Dan Klukas is a cornetist. And the audience gradually moves all the way down the street, and the last duo was Wadada Leo Smith and Vinny Golia, these two, L.A. legends. So that was based on that same idea of an exquisite corpse. That was done, produced by the Sound Organization. Society for the Activation of Social Space or something like that. It's SASSAS. You'll have to look up that abbreviation for the organization.
That's cool. I forgot to ask about Wadada's teaching style.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mentioned I would go to his house for these Sunday afternoon lessons, and usually we'd just sit down and chat for a little bit, and then we'd get the trumpets out and we'd play together and improvise, and whatever he was working on at the time, or whatever he had on his music stand that he was writing, usually is what we would look at. He also had some books of etudes and things that were written in his compositional style. He's got his own system of notation for his music, and so I began learning how his system worked. He was working on an album when I was coming down. The album was called The Golden Quartet, and Jack DeJohnette was on drums, Malachi Favors on bass, and Anthony Davis on piano. And this was like a real breakthrough album, I think, in his career. I was at his house the day Jack DeJohnette's agent called and confirmed that he would do the recording, and it was the happiest I'd ever seen Wadada, ever, that I've known him. So he was working on music for that project, and he would put the trumpet lines in front of me on the music stand and listen to me play them. And so he could hear what the trumpet sounded like, and he would kind of show me what he would do with the music and then let me improvise on it and kind of help me to find my own direction and path through the music. So it was a lot of just kind of what he was thinking about at the moment as an artist. And that's really like the CalArts style, because when I was working with him at CalArts, it was the same. Whatever he was researching and working on at that time is what he brought to the class. The classes didn't really have like a syllabus or a schedule, a set schedule like that. It was really more about sitting down with Wadada or with Charlie Hayden or with Mort Subotnick and just kind of talking through what these master musicians are working on currently. Because for an artist, like whatever is firing your creativity at the moment, that's what you have the most active information about and the most relevant information. And so as young artists, as students, being able to see our heroes and our teachers, working through that process it's an invaluable thing. And I think more so than, getting like just a class that they teach the same way every semester over and over and over again, which is kind of what you get in like the state school type model,
Yeah.
So that's what made CalArts really special. And, the first time I sat down in Leo's jazz composition class, I was expecting to learn about jazz composition because that's what it says on the schedule. And he started talking about Charles Ives. For like 2 months, we looked at Charles Ives' music. And Charles Ives was an early American, considered a classical composer, but he was really starting to change things from that classical tradition and experiment with things that wouldn't be discovered for another 20, 30 years in contemporary music. I mean, Charles Ives was in the early 20th century, and he was doing things that wouldn't even be recognized until the 50s and 60s. And so he anticipated a lot of what came to pass in experimental music and jazz in the 50s and 60s. And that whole semester we compared Charles Ives and Ornette Coleman and eventually Miles Davis, and that's what we talked about. And it was just what was on Wadada's mind. That's pretty special. I mean, if you go into a class like that expecting to have like a curriculum and assignments and, a syllabus, some of the students who were fresh out of high school didn't really know what to do with all that. We're just supposed to listen to this guy talk for 2 hours and like, what are we supposed to do? But I ate it up, man. That was exactly what I wanted. Was just to, I had already gotten close with Leo through those lessons at his house, but getting to see him at CalArts and interact with the other faculty in that way. I mean, in Charlie Hayden's class, sometimes we would just all like walk to Starbucks together and sit and listen to Charlie tell stories, about his life and his career, like while we're sipping coffee outside of a Starbucks across the street. Those were some of my favorite memories, man, of being able to, like, I remember just thinking, like, I can't believe this. I'm sitting down with this legendary musician, my hero, and we're at Starbucks and we're just like, he's just telling stories. School is amazing,
I think back to my time at BC and I think of like some of my favorite moments are kind of that. Like I remember going to deep cuts and hearing the professors and people talk about their favorite album and how it meant something to them and how a lot of those were really meaningful to me, or just when the teacher would go way off topic and talk about something they were really passionate about.
Yeah.
And those were really fun moments. Yeah.
Those are the funnest for me too as an educator, because like I know that I'm connecting with half the room who's just like they just really want to have a personal connection, with their faculty member, and then I know that like at the same time the other half of the room is just really frustrated and pissed off because like is this going to be on the quiz or what, and I can I could see it happen. Like the looks on the faces of half the students are like really, they're there with me. And then the other half, I'm just losing them. So it's always kind of a balance you have to strike in teaching in a community college or a public school. But I agree, man. Those are the best moments that I can remember as a student, is like not the assignments I did and not the lessons I learned, but the human interaction with these people who are like real people, and at the same time, like with Doug, we respect him so much, but he's also just met us where we were at as human beings, and was able to see our world through our eyes. To have a connection like that as a young person is really valuable.
Yeah, I agree. So we were just talking about Doug Davis, and he built up the jazz program at CSUB from a very small program to a very prestigious program. And it really parallels you with what you did at BC, who's been building up a good program, but a small program up to a very prestigious program at BC. Can you talk about some of the history of that?
Well, there was a long history before I arrived. The jazz ensemble at BC was started in 1962. By a faculty member named Ken Fosbender, and he was a saxophonist, and he had played in some dance bands and swing bands. And Ken was actually owned Stockdale Music later in his career. He retired from teaching and started that music store, and that's where I worked when I was in college at CSUB. So I knew Ken through that. But he called me just after I'd gotten hired full-time at BC, and he wanted to donate his saxophones to the jazz program because he saw, that I had gotten hired and that they were finally investing, in a full-time position to expand this program that he had started. And I went over to his place and he was telling me stories about the program. And he actually teared up a little bit just, as he's handing me this like professional model alto saxophone that he was just giving to us for free to use with our students. And he was talking about what BC meant to him. And I realized, like, man, this is a real deep history. And it goes back really further than that. Our archives have dug up information and photographs of swing bands as early as like the late 30s, before the Panorama campus was built. So there was jazz education and jazz music happening at Bakersfield College, like almost earlier than anywhere else in the country. But Ken said that there's a great story that I think the Lakers were coming to Bakersfield to do an exhibition game in our gym, and they wanted music, but it was going to be so many people that there's no way he could fit the marching band on the floor, or even in the stands. So he asked the administration if he could put together a studio band, or like a stage band is what they called it, big band in those days. And they approved it, and then they eventually became a course because it was so popular. But that course, which eventually became known as the Bakersfield College Jazz Ensemble, has nurtured the early careers and student experiences of so many important musicians in this town over the years. A guy named Randy Fendrick a few years ago wrote a great book called The Other Music of Bakersfield, and he's put a lot of this history in there. When the band was directed by Chuck Woods, who recently passed away. I never met Chuck except through a few Facebook messages, but he led the program in the 70s and 80s. A lot of local musicians, Tony Aguilar and Matt Munoz and folks like that, were in the band when Chuck Woods was in charge. And so when I came in 2004, I was taking over for Jim Scully, who had been there as an adjunct for a couple of years, and Jim got hired full-time at CSUB, so he moved over and he asked me to take over the jazz ensemble at BC, and I was teaching a couple of music appreciation classes at the same time, and did that as an adjunct for 13 years. Through some pretty challenging times, that economic downturn that happened in the 08, 09, when we almost lost the program, and then again the Performing Arts Center was closed down for renovations in 2011, and that ran over schedule and over budget, and so we were like rehearsing in classrooms for 3 years. We had to cancel the orchestra program. Luckily, I was able to keep enough students in the jazz ensemble to keep that going during that time, but we didn't have a theater to perform in, and we didn't have a band room to rehearse in. Students would show up and like get all of our gear out of a closet and roll it across campus and set up. At one point we were in the financial aid building, and then we'd rehearse, and then they'd have to roll it all back and put the equipment back. And anytime we'd performed, we were using outdoor spaces, to do our concerts and stuff. Finally, in 2014, the Performing Arts Center reopened. You've been in there. It's absolutely beautiful. The indoor theater, the outdoor theater, recording studio, all that stuff was brand new. The instrumental side of the program is being run by adjunct faculty at that point, and our enrollment was just like bare minimum. Fortunately, Sonia Christian, who was president of BC at the time, came in and said she wanted to put world-class programs in this world-class facility. So they started hiring instrumental director, marching arts director, commercial music director. They replaced the choral director when Ron Keene retired, and replaced him with Dr. Jennifer Garrett. Finally, in 2016, the announcement came that they were going to hire a full-time jazz studies professor to expand this program, which had been going again since like the 60s at least. And so I had to go through all of the interview process for that position, but I eventually got the job. And then 2017 began teaching at BC full-time. And in 2018, we started the new curriculum, which includes the jazz combos and jazz improvisation class and private lessons for jazz music majors.
A lot of the faculty that teach the jazz program also teach some of the recording classes, and I took some of those at BC, and it was a real treat, and I really loved learning about recording.
Yeah, we're fortunate to have those side by side, because if you're going to go to school and get a music degree and hope to be a professional musician afterwards, you've got to have some experience with the technology and to be able to make your own recordings and make demos at least and put them on. But like to go into a recording studio and know what to ask for, and to have some familiarity with that part of the industry is important. So, it's a 2-year program if you're just getting a music degree, but we really recommend students stay longer than that and get the commercial music courses done, because it's all great preparation, and you can't beat the price. Community college is the cheapest education for higher education there is.
So you've been in so many groups. I picked out a few to talk about. We can talk about other ones if I didn't bring something up, because to be fair, I'm looking at hundreds, over 100 groups, and
well, you're digging up stuff that I haven't thought about in so long. So let's see what you got.
Okay, so it's 2001. You're in the Betty Carter Jazz Ahead program at the Kennedy Center, and you meet someone that becomes a frequent collaborator.
Yeah, Mike Baggetta. Betty Carter's Jazz Ahead is a program that is really kind of rooted in straight ahead jazz, modern jazz. Man, it was so valuable they flew us into Washington, D.C. for a week. We got to rehearse with some amazing faculty. They were all legendary jazz artists and educators. Betty Carter had passed away by that point, but the program was still named after her. There was about 20 of us, and it was all original music. So we were, you had to be a composer performer to get into that program. And so we each brought like 3 compositions, and we got to play them for the class after having rehearsed them with the supervision of a faculty member. And then, we did a proposal for the final concert, which took place at the Kennedy Center, and it was streaming online. I mean, this was like new technology in 2001, so it was pretty exciting to know that not only were we playing in this legendary space, but that, it was on the internet for everybody to experience. But so I brought a couple of pieces to that. One was a little bit more of a traditional jazz thing, and then one was a kind of a very open improvisational thing, which I based on like Ornette Coleman's music. It was a song called Plastic People, and that's what I played on the final concert. But it was probably the most out there thing on the concert. It was a very kind of open improvisational piece. And I connected with Mike because he brought in sort of a bebop piece, and then a couple of his original compositions that were a little bit more original, more open as well. But for the concert, they picked his bebop piece, and he wasn't really happy with that, and he felt really kind of reined in creatively by just sort of the parameters of this program. So Mike and I kind of like got to know each other by kind of hanging out on the sidelines, complaining a little bit about the traditionalism that was dictating the music that was going to be on this concert. And we had a connection, and so Mike actually, after that, a year or two after that, started doing a really experimental project where he played this old plastic broken guitar with like alligator clips and different kind of preparations, metal objects on the strings, and just improvising on this basically dysfunctional instrument and creating this really beautiful music from it. And he made a recording called Canto. And that's when I was at CalArts, and I thought, man, this would really line up with like some of the improvisation music that I'm trying to get into. And so we booked a duo tour, having never played this music together. We just, had jammed a little bit on some jazz stuff at the Kennedy Center. But that first tour, we rehearsed one evening at my apartment, put a couple of compositions together, and then we played the next night in San Francisco. Man, LA, Bakersfield, San Francisco, I forget how far north we went. And then we made an album at the end of the week. Gradually, we continued playing together. He lived in New York at the time, so, once a year I would go out to New York and we would do a tour up in the Northeast. And he's from Massachusetts, so we would do like Boston, Portland, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. We'd play up there. And then Mike would come out here, and he had never been to the West Coast before this project, so we would go up as far as like Seattle, and all the way down to LA, and then eventually out through the Southwest and Albuquerque and Santa Fe. And we made 4 or 5 records together, and the music really evolved quickly. We got away from the more experimental things that we were doing initially, and started bringing in some music that we just loved because we were spending long hours like driving together, on these road trips. And so we were listening to like Bob Dylan and Neil Young and Townes Van Zandt, I remember, and like, all these sort of like country artists and things like that in the car. And at some point it was like, Mom, why don't we try some of this music? The first cover we did like that was a Bob Dylan song called Just Like a Woman. And that changed the music because we found each other in this harmonic language, which wasn't jazz, which was coming from this sort of country folk music tradition, but it took our original stuff in another direction. So yeah, I was real proud of the music that we did with that project because it also helped me to find a way of playing that was less experimental and more lyrical, but just as spontaneous and just as improvisational and just as honest, or maybe even more honest than the music I'd been doing up to that point in all of my projects. So we both discovered new, deeper dimensions of our own music through working together.
Yeah. I remember there's a lot of moments that I can think back to that were like moments that blew my mind at a concert. And one of them was seeing Tin Bag about 7 years ago, when all of a sudden it seems like it was really quiet. The music was kind of quiet and somber. And then all of a sudden he reaches behind his guitar and he like grabs the springs that are on the tremolo system, and he just yanks on it. And it just made this really strange sound that I wouldn't expect to come from a guitar. And it was just this really cool moment of like, whoa, this is something way different, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, Mike's really a genius of the guitar like that, because he can do everything from just rock and country music right in the tradition. You know, as experimental and as out and as noise oriented as you want, but he brings it all together, like it's all connected. There aren't you can't see the seams, you know, when he plays between these noise elements and these like traditional harmonic elements that are just beautiful and gorgeous, you know. And that's always what I've been trying to do in my own playing, is to be able to have all of the sounds and all of the colors available. And I think Mike and I spent a lot of time talking about that. Like, you know, when we started playing together, we felt like the experimental side of our playing was in one room and the traditional side of our playing was in another room. And then like we were stuck in this sort of jazz room a lot of times where we didn't know how to break out of that, but how to connect these different rooms together and to be able to move freely between these different approaches and styles. That's really what we were both working on an individual level with that project. And we found a lot of those solutions together. So when you listen to how many records did we make? 5 records that we made together. You hear that evolution, you know. In the beginning, we're playing with like scratchy, screechy sounds and noises. And then in the end, we're covering like a Patsy Cline song. You know, or our last record, we did a Leonard Cohen tune and a Willie Nelson tune alongside our own music. It was a really great journey for both of us. We haven't played together in a while. I have my thing with Kathleen Pineda now that I feel like kind of picks up where I left off with Mike, and have been able to take all those discoveries further. And Mike has these incredibly successful projects with Mike Watt on bass and Stephen Hodges on drums, his MSSV group that he's been touring with, and he's got a new version of that he's working with now. But yeah, that music was important to both of us.
You just mentioned Kathleen Pineda. How did that duo start?
Actually, on some double bills where Tin Bag would play. I think the first time was at the Blue Well in LA, and we did a few shows like this where Tin Bag would play and then Kathleen's quartet would play. And then she invited me to play a couple of songs with her quartet. And then I recorded a couple of those songs with her quartet, and then I became a member of her quartet, or her trio. It was a trio, and then they added the trumpet to make it a quartet. So I was a guest on her first album on Orenda Records, which is mostly trio. And then we did 2 more albums as a quartet with her music. And I just absolutely love playing Kathleen's music. She's an incredible just composer and pianist, and she's got this classical background. She was at CalArts as a classical piano major as an undergrad when I was there, so we didn't really know each other. Then she moved to New York and just started going out to hear jazz every night in New York City, and decided she'd rather be a jazz musician instead. And she's such an incredible musician that she could just make that decision and then switch gears and come back to CalArts and do a jazz master's degree. And she was writing incredible original music. So more and more inside of her quartet concerts, when she was writing music that that included me as the trumpet player, she would begin to write these little duet moments for her and I, where the bass player and the drummer would lay out, and then Kathleen and I would play. And those moments got bigger and bigger, and we just both loved playing together as a duo so much that we started talking about it. And I don't know when the first duo concert was, but I brought some of my pieces and she brought some of hers, and we did some covers of different things. And for both of us, I think it's been such an amazing experience to work together, because we have this natural telepathy and this ability to really read each other with total openness and honesty, and trying things, like I've brought in things by Duke Ellington and Leonard Cohen, and she's brought in her own music, some really diverse artists. Man, on our last concert, we did a transcription that I'd made of this Catholic chant that was recorded in Sri Lanka off of an old Orkora Records, a French national record label. Very rare recording, but it's just this haunting, just deep, religious chant that was done in this Buddhist community. And I transcribed that, and Kathleen and I played that as a prelude to one of her new compositions. And it works, man. Everything we have tried together has just worked. I can't say that's been the case with like any other musician I've ever played with. Just like I know, like with Kathleen, and if it doesn't seem to work, we'll figure out a way to make it work. But man, we just love playing together.
Yeah, I remember I went to the 3 Days in Space Music Festival that Killer Kern Records put on this year. I knew you were playing, and I just saw a trumpet and a piano, and I was like, huh, I've never heard of that duo. Maybe there's a bunch of records of that specific type of instrument combination, but I'd never heard of that. I was like, what is this going to sound like? And it was just really cool, and it was way different than anything else that went before it. It was really fun.
Mm-hmm. Well, that gig was so fun because, we followed Happy Now, which is like a, punk project, and Val was on stage smashing the bass and everything. And Kelso, who's a great local singer-songwriter. And man, there was just such a great energy in the room that when we get up, usually we play these concerts at jazz spaces and it's very quiet and everybody's paying attention to stuff. And we had like kids who just experienced all this punk music standing around us right in front of the stage. So we started just by playing open. We just started improvising and playing and we didn't even talk about this. We just like said, okay, go, and playing as fast and as chaotic and as dense as we could. And gradually we shifted into this composition called Sung, which is from our record, which is a piece that I wrote for Doug Davis a long, long time ago and played with him originally. And the audience was so receptive and so responsive to it. And it was, I think, one of the real great things about that day was just the diversity that they put together on that event, 3 Days in Space. Because after us was this Voodoo 5, right? An Exotica band from LA, cool. Which was another complete shift in direction. So I've always loved that kind of energy. Some of our favorite gigs with like Empty Cage Quartet were playing. Man, we played at a punk club in Olympia, Washington one time, and kids were like dancing to the music. It was not what they normally hear in this space, but we were playing this just like real out there kind of avant-garde jazz, and the kids were like dancing, man, figuring out a way to dance to it.
That's cool.
And it was so much fun. Always like plugging something unexpected into a space like that can result in some pretty surprising connections.
Is there any other groups that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, there are a few other groups that were important to me over the years. I played in a project called the Industrial Jazz Group, in my 20s when I was touring a lot with Empty Cage and with Mike Baggetta. This was another group that I was able to see other parts of the world and stuff. That group went to Italy. We played a real high-profile, sold-out gig in Milan and multiple tours over on the East Coast. And all the music was written by a guy named Andrew Durkin, and it started as an LA band that was just like 4 or 5 pieces and then gradually expanded. When I joined the band, there were 7 people in the group. This was around 2002 or 2003 while I was at CalArts. That was a lot of fun because it eventually expanded into a full big band, and we were like wearing costumes on stage, and it was like circus party music, but all really kind of like a jazz version of Frank Zappa's approach, really irreverent. And he would do these sort of satirical takes on different pop music styles and things, and it was just hilarious. It was really, really a lot of fun. And so there's a lot of recordings out that we did with that over the years. And another guy I was closely associated with was a producer and guitarist from Long Beach named Chris Schlarb, and he had a band called Psychic Temple, and there was a whole series of albums that were released. His record label is called Big Ego Records, and Mike Baggetta and I, our last album, Evening Hawks, was put out on that label. But Chris is a songwriter, and I did a couple of tours and concerts with his band. That project was a lot of fun too, because it's sort of this sort of post-genre, genreless aesthetic. The band kind of started as a jazz fusion project and eventually crossed over into all these different singer-songwriter areas. And I'm really proud of all the records that, or at least my small part, on these records that we put out with Psychic Temple over those years. And Chris is still doing it. He runs a studio in Long Beach where Big Ego is located. Yeah.
And what type of music is Psychic Temple?
Well, that's what
I know you say that it's genreless, but like what kind of instruments are in it, I guess I should say.
It depends on the album and it depends on the project. I mean, one of the records was like a hip hop record.
Okay.
One of them was, the early ones were a little bit more jazz fusion and kind of moving into like Americana folk music type territory, but and it became more of a rock band for a while. But with Chris, it was just about good music, and his models were these great producers like Brian Wilson and Joe Jackson. And when we did this national tour, we were doing a cover of Everybody Wants to Rule the World.
Tears for Fears?
Yeah, and bunch of his original music, just kind of putting all these things side by side, which you wouldn't expect to see side by side. So my view of music has been really influenced by people like this, like Mike and Chris Schlarb and Kathleen, and people who can just like pick up any genre and put their voice on it. That's not an original idea. I think it's an idea that's really central to the way creative music works these days, because we have access to everything,
Yeah.
It doesn't, when I was a kid, it was more like if you wanted to play jazz, you had to learn the jazz tradition. If you wanted to play rock, then you get involved in a rock band. If you want to play whatever style of music, if you're going to play classical music, then you have to be in a symphony orchestra. But those rules don't really exist anymore. You can be influenced by whatever, and you can pick up your phone and instantly like have access to any sound and any information that's ever existed. The genre is really the artist now and the artist's experience. And so some of the most interesting and surprising music is the music and the art that comes from like you really feel like you're experiencing a new perspective from an individual, from a human being, and not like another jazz record or another rock and roll record. It doesn't work that way anymore.
Yeah. I guess I'm the last generation that grew up like was still in an analog life. Like I grew up with VHS tapes and cassette tapes. CDs were out, but we didn't have DVDs yet. Like I just remember everything was physical, and that's when I was little. And then I watched streaming come out and YouTube and everything. And now every genre exists at the same time. It's almost like you flattened the time to where before, when I was growing up, I could turn on 98.5 The Fox and I could listen to classic rock. I could turn on the oldies station and listen to oldies, or I could listen to now. That's all. Yeah. If I wanted to find anything else, I would have to go to Goodwill and dig through records. And so now you just everything at your fingertips almost. Crazy.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I grew up too, is, analog childhood and digital adulthood.
Yeah.
That's that early millennial, like late Gen X kind of, it's the last generation that remembers life before the internet. The first time I logged on to the internet was my senior year of high school. So everything before that was a matter of tracking stuff down, going to the library, checking out CDs, saving your money, going to a record store, picking out an album. And it was such a special thing to get an album in your hands, and your entire life gets invested in that record for maybe a few weeks while you're learning it and checking it out. And it's just a completely different way to interface with information now. And so the exciting thing about that is like, all of those limits and those boundaries just don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
At the same time, I feel like, young people don't appreciate how much time and effort and attention, I guess attention is the word, that we had to put into art and culture and music, because we had such limited availability of it. And when you did get a hold of something, it could be just life-changing, and when you have a device that you're holding, I don't want to sound too old and cranky here, right? But like when you have a device that you literally have access to everything, I don't think there's that same level of just investment. I don't know. I'm trying to think of a better word.
Yeah, there's something to be said about that, especially because at a certain time you only had 5 CDs. Yeah. So that's all you could listen to. Mm-hmm. And now it's overwhelming how much you have. I have been seeing it come back around. People are so used to, kids are so used to growing up with everything digital. Now physical stuff is starting to become special again. People are making zines again. Mm-hmm. People are buying CDs. I've been seeing CDs being more popular than records right now.
That's true. And that gives me a lot of hope, for the kids who see that. Is it better to have access to everything, but like knowledge of nothing, or to have real limited access and just a couple of albums in your collection, but to know them so deeply that they might even change your life? It's a matter of just like really paying attention, and listening deeply. Yeah, that's it's getting back to something, that's more honest. And I have some hope when I see that, the younger generation is like actually smart enough to realize that there's a lot that we're missing out on just because we're overloaded with information and content.
Yeah.
I hate that word, man. It's like there's a big difference between art and content.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Moving on to a completely separate topic, the Jazz Workshop. So I know Steve Eisen started the Jazz Workshop in 2004, but you've become an integral part of that, right?
Well, I'm on the board. Yeah, I've been on the board of directors for I don't know how long, maybe 10 years or so. It's a great organization. It's been a real important place for young musicians and professional musicians to go and to meet each other and to jam together and, to have a chance to try out ideas and put bands together. And it's happened weekly. I mean, that's kind of unheard of, for anything that's a weekly presentation.
Yeah.
To last for now almost 20 years. That just doesn't happen. And like you think of places like the Village Vanguard, in New York City, that's been going on for a long, long, long time. Blue Note Records has been around forever. But, things come and go. And, Steve's been a real hero in this community for keeping that going so long. And there's a lot of support, man. People like Laura Booker and Mark Hall and Tim Stonelake and Doug Davis is on the board of directors. Kyle Burnham, Tony Rinaldi, and I are all on the board of directors. And we're more like advisors, just kind of as educators, keeping the integrity of what the workshop is about, which is really like bringing music to the community, but also encouraging students to have a place to go, a safe place, right, to go and hear music and to learn tunes and to jam and, they don't have to go to some bar or nightclub to do it, right? Or like, when I was a kid, we had to make our own opportunities. If we wanted to hear something that wasn't on a college campus, we had to start a scene at a coffee house or something like that. And that's a lot of work. But to be able to go and have a thing that happens every Tuesday night where the music is going on, it's going to be good. That's really, really valuable to our community. And it's free. We don't charge anything for it. It's a nonprofit. Yeah.
It's awesome. It's free. It's free to learn if you wanted to learn jazz, but it's also free just to go. I go there sometimes. It's really fun. It's always a fun night at the jazz workshop.
Yeah.
So looking back on your career, jazz is more than just a job for you. It's not like some professors that might teach whatever subject and then go home and not work on that subject. You really picked a job that you could teach jazz and so that you would still have the time to tour and do concerts. You've worked with the jazz workshop. I think it's really great. You've played concerts all over the world, right? You've played overseas. What's it like to bring Bakersfield jazz overseas?
Well, the groups that I toured Europe with, like Empty Cage and Tin Bag and Industrial Jazz Group, they were all collaborative projects. I remember early on getting asked that question when we would tour and, okay, where are you from? And where are you from? And where are you from, Mr. Tiner? And I'd say, well, like from California. Oh, California. Where at in California? Like, outside of LA a little bit. Okay, like, well, I've been to LA. Where outside? Well, okay, like Bakersfield. I'm from Bakersfield. And it would eventually come out. And I tried to cover that up for a while in the early days because I wanted, I was playing mostly in LA and I wanted to be a musician from LA. But I got sick of having that conversation. And at a certain point, like, I realized, just be proud of where you're from. There's so much great history here. And the fact that Bakersfield gets a rap for being like a country music oil town or whatever, that's not the whole story. And so the longer I stayed here and got invested here, after college, the more I felt like I need to do my part, to change that perception, even if it's just one little person at a time, and to work on really building something. Like the Jazz Workshop has been building for 20 years. The BC Jazz program has been around since the 60s. But, I was there for a long enough period of time where I felt like this is an opportunity to really build something lasting and meaningful. And then to use that program and that platform to bring people and present artists from other parts of the country and other parts of the world on stage. Like we brought Jeff Parker and Jeff Coffin and Jenny Scheinman and Wadada Leo Smith to BC to perform. And to, give something to this community, but also do what we can to, I don't want to say change the reputation, but just maybe add to the reputation that Bakersfield has in the national and international scene. That's one of the reasons I started Epigraph Records years ago, was to document the concerts that were happening and put some recordings out there so that the recordings would maybe hopefully have a wider reach than the concerts did. The first record we put out was a vinyl LP called Ritual Inscription, and that was reviewed in the New York City Jazz Record, which is the main jazz publication in New York. And one of the lines in that review said, "There's something different happening in Bakersfield since the days of Merle Haggard and Buck Owens and whatever." And I was really proud of that because, that's all I want to try to do, is to be able to tell people like, yeah, I'm from Bakersfield. And, if they give me some sarcastic reply, I can say, no, actually, you're wrong. There's a lot of great things that are happening here, and I'm proud to be from this area, and I'm really proud to have had the experiences that I had here. They shaped me, and my collaborations and relationships with people like Doug and Charles Brady and Paul Perez and just these amazing musicians I've got to work with over the years have really meant a lot to me.
That's awesome. I agree so much. That's so much about this podcast is about, showcasing the variety of cool Bakersfield music history that there is, because there's so much. It is bottomless how much stuff there is and how varied.
Yeah, Bakersfield has always been a music city,
Yeah.
And one thing that Kyle Burnham and I had a deep conversation about this once, and I think we both realized, like, the Bakersfield sound was always about rebellion, was always about doing your own thing.
Yep.
Buck and Merle and the folks who came before and the folks who came after as part of the Bakersfield sound, they were going against the grain of what mainstream country music was. So Nashville West wasn't just like a Nashville copy. It was a retaliation and a rebellion against what Nashville was putting out, which at the time in the 60s they called countrypolitan, real glossy kind of, a watered down version of that honky tonk music that had such an important foothold in the community here, that sort of oppressed Okie community that had come over in the 30s and 40s. So Kyle and I were talking about this and realized that, like, that's the same thing that Doug encouraged us to do when we would go to like that Pacific Coast Jazz Festival at Berkeley. Play your own music. Don't go up there and try to play what every other college band is playing. Play your own music and present the music on your own terms. And that's what I try to impart to my students at BC. Write your music and make it sound like you're from Bakersfield. Don't try to make it sound like you're from New York or New Orleans or anywhere else. Like, make the music sound like you and find something that's honest. And if you're inspired by something that's outside of the jazz tradition, that's okay. That's to be encouraged, because that's really where we are now as a culture. And who wants to hear a kid from Bakersfield trying to sound like they're not? I think it's much more important to take that next step of like, what's the Bakersfield sound now? Man, there's so many great artists and bands around town now that are taking that a step further and not just copying the past, but stepping into their own place in that tradition.
I agree with what you're saying. If you listen to what Nashville was putting out before Buck Owens came out with his twin Telecaster songs, which are very rock and roll compared to country, 2 electric guitars was unheard of. And I think that happened again in the 90s with Korn, because no rock band sounded like Korn. No one. A lot of people sounded like them after.
Yeah, and you have the opportunity, being from a small community like that, to reinvent the bigger scene.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what grunge was. Looking at being from a small community as an opportunity and not as a detriment, I think, is the first step for an artist, if you're going to have any reach beyond that community with your music.
At the end of the episode, we always talk about music recommendations. So what Bakersfield music, past or present, do you recommend for people to listen to?
There's a great singer who I just got to work with or shared a bill with a couple nights ago named Kelso. She's writing some really, really creative, witty songs, and I just love like the harmonies and stuff that she uses. Plays ukulele and keyboard, and mostly a solo act. And I feel like there's a really exciting wave of young jazz musicians coming through right now. They are people who have been through the program at BC, who are starting to do what you're supposed to do, which is get out there and create a band and start hitting up gigs. And there's a group called Paranoia, which are some students at BC who are just about finished with the program. There's a group called the Nash Quartet, that are former students of mine. And I love that these guys are getting out and trying to contribute something to the scene, and not just rely on school, to give them performance opportunities. That's what I really try to impart is like, if you want something to happen and the phone's not ringing, then you've got to create your own opportunity. So getting out, hitting up open mics, like finding venues that are willing to host live music and just making it happen for yourself, writing music, recording it. That's the name of the game. And that's how you start. Who knows where it's going to take you, but you've got to like have the faith and the courage to take that first step. You can't allow yourself to be intimidated by the folks who are older than you who are already doing it, because they were your age once, and I try to be real honest with my students about that. Like I was where you were. The only thing that got me out of the academic environment with my music was just like having the courage to go out and say like, I've got a band. Do you need live music at your place? This is how much it costs. And just having the confidence to do that. And, having an educator like Doug who, encouraged us to write our music and put us on stage, and like at the jazz festival to play it in front of thousands of people. That's big. That's a big opportunity because you've got to either find that courage or else, right? Or else you just self-destruct in that situation. And I chose to like find the courage and then that, once you get past something like that, then it becomes easy to maybe hit up a restaurant or a coffee house or something. So I try to give my students those kind of opportunities and just encourage them to get out there and do it. Like if you say it's real, it's real. Get a business card, put a website up, put a social media page up for your band, put some pictures up there, and suddenly you look like a band. And then, as long as you're practicing and you're rehearsing and you're staying on top of it and trying to improve, you'll have what you need to back it up. I always tell them, like, you just need an hour of music, right? You can get an hour's worth of music together in a couple hours of rehearsal and then go play a show. And then you might find somebody at that show that has a connection or they want you to play at their place, and then you go play another show. And then somebody at that show approaches you. If the music's good and it's quality, one opportunity will lead to another, and that's how you network and build a network of contacts and opportunities. But you've got to put it out there. You've got to like take the first step.